All right, so today we're going to be um, taking a deep dive into the mind of Mark Manson and his book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck.
Yeah, this is definitely not your typical self-help
All
book,
right.
though, right?
It's definitely got a bit more of an edge to it,
Yeah.
but we're going to go straight to the source.
Yeah.
We're using his writing to unpack his ideas on strategic non-attachment
Yeah.
and value-based living.
So really, like, actually make our lives better.
Right, exactly. So it's not just theory. We
Mhm.
want to see how we can actually apply this stuff.
Absolutely. I think what's really interesting about Manson is he kind of flips the script on what we think about self-improvement, right?
Yeah.
He's not telling us to chase happiness or, like, be positive all the time,
Yeah.
which is kind of what we're used to.
Yeah, it's a little bit more like, well, figure out what matters to you and then focus your energy on that.
Exactly. And be willing to embrace maybe some uncomfortable truths along the way.
Yeah, it's like he's saying, hey, life's going to throw you some curveballs, so you've got to decide which ones you're willing to swing at.
Yes.
And to kind of illustrate this point, he starts off with this story about Charles Bukowski,
Yeah.
who,
I love Bukowski.
oh yeah, a fascinating guy,
Yeah.
who found success kind of later in life after facing a lot of rejection.
Yeah, and I think what's so interesting about Bukowski is he was really not afraid to embrace his flaws, right?
Right.
He even had "Don't Try" engraved on his tombstone,
Yes.
which sounds very paradoxical.
Right.
But it really speaks to this idea that success isn't always about, like, striving to be the best or, winning in this very conventional sense. It's about being true to yourself and finding your own path. And that might mean, like, embracing what other people see as failures.
Okay, so I'm starting to see where this whole not giving effect thing comes in, right?
Yeah.
It's not about being apathetic or indifferent.
No.
It's about being selective
Yes.
with our energy and attention.
Absolutely. And I think that's where this term strategic non-attachment comes in.
Okay.
Which is what Manson talks about.
Right.
And it's this idea that we're just bombarded constantly with messages telling us to care about everything.
Right.
To be successful, to be attractive, to be popular, to be wealthy, all of these things, and trying to care about all of that is exhausting.
Yeah.
And it's just not sustainable.
Yeah. It's like we're all running on this hamster wheel
Right.
of achievement, but we never actually get anywhere.
Totally. And that's where I think Manson's definition of maturity comes in.
Okay.
He says that, maturity isn't about achieving some arbitrary level of success or status,
Right.
but it's about learning to only give a feck about what is truly fuckworthy
Yeah.
based on your own values.
Okay. I love that phrase, fuckworthy.
Yeah.
That's definitely going in my lexicon.
Yeah.
But how do we even begin to figure out
Yeah.
what is fuckworthy for us?
Right. That's the big question, right?
Yeah.
And he uses this sort of funny character called Disappointment Panda
Right.
to kind of illustrate this point.
Yeah, disappointment panda.
Yeah.
I love you.
So tell us about Disappointment Panda.
Well, he's this, kind of this metaphor for accepting negative emotions. Like disappointment, sadness, anger, even fear
Yeah.
as signals that something needs to change.
Exactly. It's not about wallowing in them or, like,
Right.
staying stuck in them.
Right.
But it's about seeing them as, like, oh, this is information. This is telling me something.
Yeah.
This is an opportunity for growth.
So instead of trying to avoid negative emotions at all costs, we should actually lean into them.
In a way, yeah.
Okay.
Because Manson argues that happiness doesn't come from avoiding problems,
Right.
but from solving them.
Okay.
And, those negative emotions, often they're pointing to the problems that need to be solved. They're
Okay.
like, hey, pay attention over here.
That reminds me of that story he tells about the prince who becomes the Buddha.
Yeah.
He leaves his life of luxury and comfort to seek enlightenment through suffering.
Right. And I think that's a really great example of how challenges and even suffering can be catalysts for growth. It's not about seeking out pain, but it's about accepting that it's an inevitable part of life.
Yeah.
And then instead of resisting it, we can choose to see it as an opportunity to learn and evolve.
So it's about choosing the right problems to solve.
Yes,
The ones that align with our values and lead us toward a more fulfilling life.
exactly. And sometimes that means letting go of problems that aren't really ours to solve
Right.
or that we don't need to be focusing on.
Okay. I think I'm starting to get this.
Good.
But how do we translate this into real life action?
Right.
How do we figure out what to give a feck about and what to let go of?
Well, that's where we start to get into, like, the nitty-gritty of Manson's philosophy, and that's what we're going to talk about next.
All right. Sounds good.
Yeah. Welcome back. So we've talked about how it's all about, like, figuring out what's truly important to us, what Manson called a fuckworthy,
Yeah.
and then focusing our energy on those things. But how do we even know what those things are?
Yeah. right? Like most of us are running around with these stories in our heads about who we are and what we want. But what if those stories are wrong?
Totally. And Manson actually addresses that head on in the book. He argues that a lot of our beliefs about ourselves are based on, you know, unexamined assumptions, cultural conditioning, or even straight up delusion.
Delusion. Okay, that's a strong
Uh,
word.
it is, but think about it. We're constantly bombarded with messages about what a good life should look like.
Right.
We see these perfect images on social media and advertising, movies, TV shows, and we start to internalize these messages
Right.
and measure ourselves against these external standards that may not even be realistic or align with our true
Yeah,
values.
it's like we're all chasing after this elusive ideal of happiness and success that's constantly being sold to us.
Exactly. And it creates this feeling of never being enough, of
Yeah.
always needing to strive for more, acquire more, be more.
Always be hustling.
Yeah, exactly. And Manson calls this the feedback loop from hell.
Hmm.
This constant cycle of comparing ourselves to others and feeling inadequate.
So how do we break free from this loop? How do we actually start to identify our own values, the things that are truly fuckworthy for us?
Well, Manson suggests that the first step is to develop self-awareness,
Yeah.
to start questioning our assumptions and be willing to admit that we might be wrong.
Okay.
Like he encourages us to ask ourselves tough questions like, what if I'm wrong about this? Or
Yeah.
what if the opposite is true?
He talks about a friend's brother who was constantly criticizing his sister's engagement, like convinced that she was making this huge mistake.
Right.
But Manson suggested that maybe the brother's behavior was actually stemming from his own insecurities about marriage and commitment.
Exactly.
Like sometimes our judgments about others are really just reflections of our own internal struggles.
Yeah, it's like projecting our own stuff onto other people.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's about developing the humility to recognize that we don't have all the answers and that our initial judgments are often clouded by our own biases and experiences.
Okay, so how do we cultivate this self-awareness? Do we need to go on some kind of soul-searching retreat?
Well, it doesn't have to be that complicated. Manson actually emphasizes the importance of action over introspection.
Okay.
So he has this principle he calls do something.
Do something. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Yeah, so it's this idea that we often get stuck in analysis paralysis, overthinking things and waiting for the perfect moment or the perfect plan.
Right.
But Manson says that action creates its own momentum. So even if you don't have all the answers taken, even a small step forward can help you gain clarity and figure out what works for you.
It's like that saying, the best way to predict the future is to create it.
Exactly. And it ties into Manson's point about embracing uncertainty. He actually says that being wrong is a good thing.
Wait, what? How can being wrong be a good thing?
Because it means we're learning, we're growing, we're updating our understanding of the world. If we're never wrong, it probably means we're not taking enough risks or challenging ourselves enough.
So it's about being open to new information and perspectives, even if they contradict what we currently believe.
Right. It's about recognizing that our beliefs are constantly evolving and that clinging to certainty can actually hinder our growth.
This all sounds great in theory, but changing our deeply held beliefs and values? It sounds, well, really hard. Are we just supposed to wake up one morning and decide to care about different things?
Well, Manson acknowledges that it's not easy. He talks about the discomfort, the uncertainty, the feeling of being a loser when we first start challenging our old ways of thinking and behaving.
Right.
It's like we have to go through a kind of death of our old selves, our old identities, in order to make space for something new to emerge.
It almost sounds kind of scary.
He compares it to like weathering a shitstorm. It's not about avoiding the storm, but about learning to navigate it, to find our footing amidst the chaos and uncertainty. And that requires courage, resilience, and a willingness to embrace the discomfort of growth.
So how do we navigate this shitstorm? Where do we even begin?
Well, one of the most important things, according to Manson, is learning to say no. And it's not just about saying no to like external distractions or obligations,
Right.
but also about saying no to those internal voices of self-doubt and fear that hold us back from pursuing what truly matters.
So it's about setting boundaries both with ourselves and with others.
Exactly.
Protecting our time, our energy, and our values.
Yeah, and Manson actually connects this to the idea of freedom through commitment.
Okay.
So it seems counterintuitive, but he argues that by committing to a few things that truly matter to us, we actually free ourselves from the tyranny of constantly chasing after more, more, more.
It's about choosing depth over breadth.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that true fulfillment often comes from the slow, steady work of building something meaningful, whether it's a relationship, a skill, a career, or a contribution to something larger than ourselves.
Okay, I think I'm starting to understand this concept of strategic non-attachment. But I'm curious, what role does death play in all of this? Manson talks a lot about death anxiety and how it shapes our values.
That's right. Manson actually draws heavily on the work of Ernest Becker, who argued that our fear of death is a fundamental driving force behind much of human behavior.
Mm.
He even talks about his own experience confronting his fear of death while sitting on the edge of a cliff in South Africa.
Yeah, that seemed like a real turning point for him.
It was, and it led him to the realization that embracing our mortality, however uncomfortable it might be, can actually be a source of liberation
How so?
because it frees us from the illusion of immortality
Yeah.
and allows us to focus on what truly matters in the here and now. If we're constantly denying our mortality, we tend to cling to things that ultimately don't matter. Possessions, status, approval from others. But when we acknowledge that our time is limited, it helps us prioritize the things that bring us genuine joy and fulfillment.
Wow, that's a powerful thought.
Hmm.
So it's not about ignoring death, but about using it as a lens to clarify our values and make the most of our limited time.
Duh.
Okay, so we're back, and we've explored a lot of Manson's ideas, right? From this whole idea of strategic non-attachment to the role of death anxiety. But I'm curious, how do we actually put all this into practice?
Well, Manson doesn't just leave us hanging with a bunch of abstract concepts.
Right.
He gets us some really concrete strategies for applying this stuff to our lives.
Okay.
And one of the most important ones is taking responsibility for our own emotions.
Okay, that sounds like classic self-help advice, but I have a feeling Manson puts a different spin on it.
He does. He's not saying we're to blame for every bad thing that happens to us,
Right.
but he is saying that we have a choice in how we respond to those events.
Okay.
So he uses the example of his own experience going through a painful breakup.
Yeah.
And he realized that while he wasn't at fault for his ex's actions, he was still responsible for his own emotional well-being.
So instead of dwelling on the unfairness of the situation or whatever, he chose to focus on what he could control.
Exactly, like his own reactions and his own choices.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do we actually do that? Like, how do we take responsibility for our emotions when we're just overwhelmed by them?
Well, one key strategy that Manson emphasizes is setting boundaries.
Boundaries. Like telling people to back off when they get too close?
Well, that's part of it, but it goes deeper than that. It's about emotional boundaries, taking responsibility for our own needs and emotions, and not expecting other people to manage them for us.
Okay, can you give me some examples of what that looks like?
Yeah, so think about those classic patterns in unhealthy relationships where people are either trying to offload their emotional baggage onto others, or they're trying to become the savior, constantly rescuing their partner from their own messes.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that dynamic play out before.
Right, and so it's about recognizing that we're all responsible for our own lives, our own choices, our own happiness,
Right.
and that includes setting boundaries to protect ourselves from emotional vampires and overhelpers alike.
Yeah, okay. I can see how that ties into the whole not giving effect philosophy,
Exactly.
It's about choosing our battles wisely and focusing our limited energy on the things that truly matter to us.
Right. It's about saying no to the things that drain us, that don't align with our values, or that are simply not our responsibility.
But let's be honest, saying no can be really hard, especially to people we care about.
Absolutely. Manson acknowledges that it's not always easy. He talks about the discomfort, the guilt, the fear of rejection that can come with saying no.
Right? It's like we're conditioned to be people pleasers, to always put others' needs before our own.
Totally. But he argues that learning to say no is essential for building healthy relationships. When we're able to say no authentically, it creates trust and respect.
It shows that we value ourselves and our own needs.
Exactly. And it also allows other people to be responsible for their own lives. It frees us from the burden of trying to fix everyone and everything.
That makes me think about Manson's point about the connection between saying no and building trust. He uses the example of a couple where one partner is cheated, and it seems counterintuitive. But he suggests that honesty about the betrayal and setting firm boundaries is actually crucial for rebuilding trust.
Totally. It's about acknowledging the hurt that's been caused, taking responsibility for one's actions, and then demonstrating through consistent behavior that the betrayal won't happen again.
Yeah, it's a reminder that trust is fragile and takes time and effort to repair.
Absolutely. And this leads us back to one of Manson's most thought-provoking ideas, the concept of freedom through commitment.
I'm still wrapping my head around that one. How can committing to something actually make us feel more free?
Well, Manson argues that when we commit to something, whether it's a person, a career, a creative pursuit, a set of values, We're essentially saying no to all the other possibilities out there.
We're closing some doors in order to fully open others.
Exactly. And that can be incredibly liberating. We're no longer constantly scanning the horizon for something better, something more exciting, something more fulfilling.
We're free to invest our energy and attention in the things we've chosen without that fear of missing out.
Right. And that allows us to experience the depth of satisfaction that comes from mastery, from long-term dedication, from building something truly meaningful.
So to bring this all back to the beginning, Manson's philosophy is about choosing what to give a feck about
Yeah.
and then giving those things our wholehearted attention.
It's about letting go of the need to control everything, to be perfect, to be right all the time. It's about accepting our limitations, our flaws, and our mortality.
And it's about finding the freedom that comes from embracing the things that truly matter, even in the face of uncertainty, pain, and loss.
Exactly.
This deep dive has been quite a journey. We've unpacked a lot of thought-provoking ideas. What are some key takeaways that you hope our listener will walk away with?
Well, I think Manson's work reminds us that happiness isn't about chasing fleeting pleasures or avoiding pain altogether. It's about finding meaning and purpose in the things we choose to give a feck about. It's about defining our own values, setting boundaries, and taking responsibility for our own lives. And it's about recognizing that even negative experiences can be opportunities for growth and learning.
Beautifully said.
Mm.
Any final thoughts for our listeners as they continue to explore these ideas?
Well, as Manson says, choosing better things to give a feck about leads to better problems and ultimately a better life. So I would encourage our listener to reflect on what truly matters to them, what they're willing to struggle for, and what they can let go of. The answers to those questions will guide them towards a more fulfilling and authentic life.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you. And to our listener, we encourage you to dive deeper into Manson's work and see what resonates with you. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep giving a feck about the things that matter most.